Before we start the discussion, we're going to recognize 3 people who entered the Naval History Essay Contest. And this is what the Naval Institute's all about, is writing, publishing, and engaging on this stage. So let me introduce our 3rd place winner, Lieutenant Joshua Duran. Josh came from HM-14 as a Squadron Intelligence Officer and is now the current command is the Nimitz Op Intel Center at the National Maritime Center in Suitland, Maryland. Josh? Rachel, chairman of our editorial board and the editor-in-chief of our magazine, is going to come up here and have a picture taken as soon as Josh tells us who he wrote about and why in less than 27 seconds.
Good evening. I'm Lieutenant Josh Duran. My topic for this competition was Miss Agnes Meyer Driscoll, and I'll keep it brief. She was one of the pioneers in Navy cryptology and then cryptanalysis during the periods from World War I to World War II. So largely forgotten to history, but hopefully not anymore. Thank you.
Okay, stay here. You two stay. You can go back. Okay, our 2nd place winner was Lieutenant Ben Drew. Drew is currently an anesthesiologist residence at the Naval Medical Center in Portsmouth, and prior to being a physician, he was a submarine officer.
Thank you so much to the U.S. Naval Institute for providing this forum with which to discuss Lena Higby. She was quite a pioneer for women in the military and the Navy, the 2nd Superintendent of the Nurse Corps, the first woman to receive the Navy Cross, the first woman to have a warship named after her not once, but actually now twice. And actually, she was the head of the Nurse Corps during 2 of the world's worst humanitarian crises, to include World War I and also the Spanish influenza. And quite a redoubtable figure, nonetheless, but quite interesting. Thank you very much.
Okay, our 1st place winner you'll find is a shy retiring individual. This is Lieutenant Andrea Goldstein. She served on active duty from 2009 to 2016, continues in the reserves, also Naval Intelligence Admiral Daly. I want to tell you, Naval Intelligence is well represented. She is now, and we do this in the blind. We have to really tell you this. We don't know who the authors are. So when you hear that she is an international relations student at Tufts University, Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, where our chairman happens to be the dean, we knew nothing about it. Come on.
Thank you to the Naval Institute for this opportunity and for my in-laws who are here tonight. I wrote about generations of women. Women in combat is part of our history. The first woman combat veteran that we know of is Deborah Sampson. She served during the Revolutionary War. Sarah Emma Emmons and Jenny Hodgers served during the Civil War, and those 3 were disguised as men. We have to thank Virginia Hall, who was one of the first women in the OSS, which became the CIA and Special Operations Forces. And then the 4 mothers for the current generation are Special Operations Forces enablers, many of whom are currently serving and are unnamed. And then the last proof that we needed were the combat support teams. We can remember Ashley White and Jenny Moreno, who were killed in Afghanistan. So we have them to thank for being here now and for the doors that they opened. Thank you.
Thank you, and I think you're going to be reading from articles from these three contributors a lot in future years in proceedings and naval history. Thank you.
The first Gulf War shed light on the logistical challenges of policies precluding women from combat. In 1991, the Aviation Combat Exclusion Policy was lifted, and in 1994, 80% of fields were open to women, enabling them to serve on combatants. Despite this progress, 1994 marked the same year that the Direct Ground Combat Exclusion Rule was also implemented, stating, "Service members are eligible to be assigned to all positions for which they are qualified, except that women shall be excluded from assignment to units below the brigade level, whose primary mission is to engage in direct combat on the ground." September 11th, 2001, changed the trajectory of our nation, our military, and our women in service. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were unprecedented. The enemy and nature of warfighting were like none other. Attempts to protect and preclude women from direct ground combat were impossible and stood in the way of mission effectiveness. Women soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines stood directly alongside their male counterparts while confronting the enemy. Naval Academy graduates like Major Megan McClung, class of '95, and Captain Jennifer Harris, class of 2000, were killed in action while serving on the front lines in Iraq. Whether in the air, on land, or at sea, it became evident that the lines were blurred. Women were there, yet doors remained closed. In April 2013, Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta announced the decision to end the Direct Ground Combat Exclusion Policy, indicating that military occupations would only be closed to women by exception after thorough review. In January 2016, Secretary of Defense Ash Carter announced there would be no exceptions. Gayle Lemmon is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and the author most recently of the New York Times bestseller, Ashley's War, the untold story of a team of women soldiers on the Special Ops battlefield. Ms. Lemmon began her career as a journalist in Washington. From 1997 to 2004, she covered presidential politics and public policy issues for the ABC News political unit and served as an editorial producer during the first year of This Week with George Stephanopoulos. In 2004, she left ABC News to pursue her interest in international development and began MBA study at Harvard. It was during this time that she began reporting from conflict regions and has reported on Afghanistan since 2005, when she made her first trip to the country. As women continue to embrace the chance to lead in an organization with neither exceptions nor visible barriers, the unspoken and unforeseen challenges they will face will be similar to those of their predecessors. Tonight, Ms. Lemmon will lead our panel in a conversation to highlight how the wild things of today's generation of military leaders turns yesterday's challenges into tomorrow's opportunities.
Good evening, everyone. I'm really delighted to be here. And I want to start with the profession of ignorance, and then I want to put forward a theory as to why that exists, and then I want to go ahead and introduce our incredible group of panelists. And the first is that in terms of profession of ignorance, when I came to the story of First Lieutenant Ashley White and the story of the women of the cultural support team who had been out on Army Ranger and Navy SEAL missions back in 2011, while the combat ban was very much in place. It was 2012. And I remember hosting an event on a topic I was not terribly interested in, women in combat, because it was three words that were an abstraction. If you say I have a war story for you, I have a story about great individuals, about Americans who served, I'm in. But if you say I have a story for you about women in combat, like most of America, my eyes glazed over. And here was a story about this incredible group of young women who had answered the call when their nation had asked. And there was just one story among so many. And I remember turning to a Marine who was sitting next to me and said, wow, wow, so there were this whole, and I covered Afghanistan, so I was just triply ignorant to not know that this group of young women existed. And I said to a Marine, so wait a minute, but what about the combat ban? How were these soldiers out with Rangers and SEALs? And my husband, who is a Naval Academy grad, has a mother who is a native Texan. And whenever you say something really stupid, she goes, bless your heart. And that is the look that those Marines, who happen to be women, gave me when I said, well, how were they out there in that combat band? And they gave me that look, that bless your heart, you don't know anything, look. And that was the challenge. And I thought, goodness, if I'm somebody who spent time in Afghanistan, I've covered this war, I thought I understood what was happening. How is it that we are so removed from the people who fight these wars and why they fight, and the fact that some of them might just be women? And I do think, and I want to get to this in the conversation tonight, that part of the reason why we still have this conversation about can women do it, which is not the conversation we're going to have tonight, is because less than 1% of this country has fought 100% of its wars for more than 15 years. And there is a distance between those who serve and everybody else that I truly believe stories are a huge part of bridging. And it's urgent, because I don't think we can have just a warrior caste and everybody else. Because then when it comes time to conversations about how we lead and how we define leadership and how we talk about women on the front lines, we're so far removed as an American public from who it is that's been doing the fighting that the conversation starts well behind the 50-yard line. We're not even close to the end zone. So I bring that up because I wanted to, my own ignorance and education to help be a proxy for so much of the distance between the public conversation and your personal experiences of leadership, and what that distance means for the conversation going forward about who fights America's wars and why they do it. Because this is not a women's conversation. This is a national security conversation. So with that, I want to start by introducing my pretty diverse and also incredibly interesting panel. So Anuradha Bhagwati is a Marine Corps officer and also the founder of SWAN, Service Women's Action Network, and now working on her memoir, which I'm sure she will tell us about tonight. And next to her are more people who have logged all kinds of firsts. Commander Holly Harrison, who I'm going to read this because I think this is just kind of fascinating collection of firsts. The first woman to command a Coast Guard vessel in a combat zone, and the first woman in the Coast Guard to earn the Bronze Star. I'm sure you would never tell us this, so I'm so glad I could read it. Lieutenant Kayla Barron is actually a U.S. Naval Academy 2010 graduate and a member of the first Naval Academy class of women to serve on submarines. And Major Katelyn van Dam, who I've gotten to know over the years from the United States Marine Corps, was also a Marine Corps attack helicopter pilot and co-founder of No Exceptions, which was a movement that was calling for no exceptions before the Secretary of Defense said there will be no exceptions. So I'd like to start with this question of leadership. And I'll start, if I could, because I'd like to start with the question of, we've had this discussion of an abstraction of, can women lead, should women lead, and now the verdict is in, right? But what is the leadership that you think is going to make the difference in turning the discussion from an abstraction to the actual implementation of no exception?
I've been listening to a lot of smart women today. So I'm collecting my thoughts. I come to this conversation from a strong Marine Corps perspective.
Yeah.
And I believe the Marine Corps is a unique culture that needs to change desperately. So,
in what way?
I'm probably the first to have left I think, the military on this panel. And I have had a lot of time reflecting on my experience, and most of my time actually has been as a veterans advocate at this point, advocating for change for women in the service. And I don't know that the military as a whole is going to move forward until the Marine Corps moves forward. So, you know, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force are moving forward by leaps and bounds, and yet there's this other branch in the Coast Guard, but there's this other branch that is moving so incrementally and with such contempt for outside opinions about the place and the role and the accomplishments of women. And it's harming the larger whole. It has harmed the larger whole. You know, it doesn't help when all of the leaders of the other branches of service are publicly displaying their enthusiasm for integration, and you have this one branch of service that has consistently done the opposite. It hurts when you hear the Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps saying things he shouldn't be saying about the integration of women in combat. You know, there are such incredibly talented women serving in the Marines right now who are trying out for these pretty incredible roles, just like the general was saying this morning. And we should be supporting them, not you know, kicking them down before they've even started. So, you know, they've got a long way to go, and I would hope that they become more a part of this conversation instead of resisting so hard, so strongly.
Well, I'm going to go to stay in the Marine Corps family for a moment and go to you, Major, and say, you know, what is the leadership question here? Because there does still seem to be a kind of push me, pull you about how far do we go and at what pace. And I wonder how you see the Marine Corps' role in this and what you see the leadership question.
Yeah, I think a lot of this really comes down to, first off, fostering discussion, right? We can't just tell people what to do and not give them avenues to say why, or we need explanations, not why women should be there. Let's clear the air. Obviously, I'm a huge supporter of why that everybody should be there. But that brings me to my next point is everything's a meritocracy, or at least we like to think it is, right? So if the leadership is saying, hey, I want the best out there. I don't care what you look like, who you go home to at the end of the night, but I want the best and strongest unit. That's really where a lot of this conversation needs to begin. Yeah. And those expectations, like all things, go down through the ranks. And not to belabor this too much longer, but investing in diversity, not for the sake of investing in diversity, right? Not for diversity itself, but because I, as a company commander, let's say, I recognize that if I have a diverse group, I have 3 platoon commanders and an XO, right? Those are the 4 officers normally below me. If I have an XO who, let's say, is a first-generation American, right? I have a platoon commander who's a woman. I have another platoon commander who's daddy's daddy's daddy, fought in the Civil War. They've been wearing uniforms the whole time. He's from the Deep South, right? And then my other platoon commander, maybe that platoon commander is a first-generation Marine. All of these individuals bring extremely diverse perspectives and point of view. So when I have this issue today that I have to solve, I'm going to listen to all of them, and then as the company commander, I'm going to make my decision. Well, then tomorrow is going to bring an entirely new, diverse set of issues, and I have this extremely diverse set of individuals and brains that I've invested in training and melding together as a group, and tomorrow I have a different issue and different perspectives. So I think if we really look at it from a holistic perspective of how is it going to make the Corps and the other services stronger, but more specifically, we have to help these leaders understand why it's going to make their unit stronger, because at the end of the day, my squadron's better than all the rest of them, especially the ones that fly fast. So, you know, that's our mentality as Marines, right? So we have to encourage people to have that mentality and why integration on so many forms is good for their unit and good for the Corps at large.
So, you know, how do you think about the question of yourself as a leader in a time of change? Right? Because clearly this is a moment where things are shifting, new opportunities are opening up. How do you think of the role of your own leadership, and then what do you think is the key for the leadership under whom you're serving?
Leadership has played a huge role in the integration of women into my community for sure. And I think one thing that the submarine community has done really well is they've been really honest about the policies and the plan. People tend to get upset pretty quickly if they don't understand what's going on. They can make up their own narrative. And so the leadership's been very careful about shaping that narrative themselves. It's not to say there haven't been some missteps along the way. I definitely think there's been a few mistakes here and there, but the submarines culture is one of a self-critical attitude, always trying to improve. And that comes from our nuclear training, really. That's at the heart of what
Fairly high stakes.
Yeah, you're operating a nuclear reactor, you can't screw that up. And if you can get better, you want to do better all the time. And I think they've applied that culture to our integration as well. Every time there's been something that's upset me, or I didn't think that something was being handled the right way, I've always felt comfortable saying, hey, sir, maybe a much more senior officer who's not used to working with women. That was kind of a problem, and here's how it was perceived by the crew, by the women. And we were able to have a mature conversation about how to do better in the future and how we were going to assess that we were improving and not just say we were going to do better. So I think institutionally we've done a really good job. There's been some challenges with a few individuals, but I would say overall the community's been really receptive. And I've always been surprised. You see the 24-hour news cycle, repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, women on submarines. It's easy to blow these things up like it's going to be some huge cultural change and it's going to shake everything up. And then we all come to work the next day as people in uniform, and nothing's different. Maybe some of your peers, subordinates, leaders are more comfortable in uniform that day because they can be themselves. Women show up on submarines, and guess what? The crew wants to know, are you competent? Are you pleasant to work with? Let's go. And they're ready to train you, and they want you to lead them. And so I would say institutionally it's gone really well for us. And a lot of that is about communication and a self-critical attitude.
But it's interesting because I remember a Ranger First Sergeant who did 13 special operations deployments in the post 9/11 wars, who I talked to pretty frequently in the process of writing and reporting, would say to me, a job well done stands out. I don't care who's doing it. And 15 years into America's longest war, I really don't care who's doing it. Right? And so I think that often, and maybe I say this as a civilian, so I can give civilians a hard time too, but there is such a perception that somebody else in uniform is going to have a problem with it, so it must be an issue. Whereas I think that a lot of folks who are mission focused, which is, most of the military, for them it is about the mission, it is about getting the job done, and you see that over and over again, or at least I do as an outsider, you see that. I want to turn to you, Commander, because you have been a groundbreaker, and my guess is you would never consider yourself one. It was entirely just through doing things that you loved and that you were driven to do. But I wonder what leadership has meant to you. Did you have mentors along the way who really showed you what was possible, or was it such that you thought, oh, I'm leaving a path for those behind me, or both?
Sort of a mix. As far as mentorship goes, it's interesting. Mentoring starts all young age, all over the place. Mentors come in all shapes, sizes, and forms. I actually don't have any female mentors in my units. They're men. That's just who I've worked with. And they're civilians. I have pilots. I have cuttermen, all specialties. These are people who were able to give me advice in a number of different ways. My mother, who's sitting up here, was one of the first women through Officer Candidate School in 1970 with the Navy. She's been a role model for me since I was very little. So for me, joining the military was no big issue. It's interesting when you mention about culture. When I joined the Coast Guard in 1991, starting in 1978, all jobs for officers enlisted, every single job in the Coast Guard had been open to women. So now when I joined in 1991, there were no limits. So for me, the doors were wide open. And when you talk about if you get the job done, that's what matters. Women had been getting the job done. So there were no issues for me. Later on, when my ship was called up to go overseas to Iraq, there were 4 cutters. 3 of the cutters had all-male crews. My cutter, it was an all-male crew, except for me as the commanding officer. And at the time, I knew what the DoD policy was on women in combat, and I wondered, would the Coast Guard, what would their view be? Would the Navy not want me over there? I didn't even have to raise the question, because the Coast Guard commander who we were working for came up to me and said, you're commanding officer of that ship, we're sending the ship, you're part of that crew, you're going.
And
the conversation was over.
What were the reactions when people saw you, or did people who were not Coast Guard see you in that role?
I don't think anyone really batted an eye. It comes down to your crew wants to know, are you going to keep them safe? Are you going to get the job done? Are you a good shipmate? Can they trust you? And as long as you do those things, it didn't matter. So women have proven themselves over and over again. It can be done. I think for your example, they need to be given the opportunity, and they'll prove it time and time again.
I want to throw out a question which an editor asked me recently, and I honestly don't have a great answer for it, so I'm going to give you all my homework, which is, do you think women lead differently? And I'd like to start and go this way because, you know, I think it's a really interesting question as we look at, in the context of being in uniform, do you think that women have a different leadership style? And I was recently with some Ranger School candidates, male and female, who had a really interesting take on this also.
I think they can lead differently. I mean, it depends on what you're comparing it to. I think we consider leadership in this kind of monolithic way.
Yes.
It tends to be male and white and
Right.
heterosexual, and sort of people in power look this way and they act this way and they talk this way. And I remember going through Marine Corps officer training, and there was like this archetype of strong, powerful leadership. And if you spoke loudly enough and you're confident enough, it didn't matter what the words were that were coming out of your mouth. You're like, you were right, you're a strong leader. And so, I kind of, I learned some of that model of leadership myself. And you sort of had to in order to survive. I mean, I remember, even way back, like first few weeks, drill instructors trying to get the bass in our voices, which is like a medical miracle for some women, right? Like there's only so deep some women can go. It's only so deep some men can go, right? So, what exactly the correlation between a deep voice and leadership ability is, I'm not really sure how they've worked that out yet, but these are the types of things that I think women in male-dominated institutions have to reckon with, not just in the military. So, some of, I think, survival tactics for me and other women I knew that were leaders or commanders in the Marine Corps involved being like the good mentors and commanders we knew. I didn't have a single female mentor my entire time in the Marines. I had a couple of strong male mentors, but it was kind of figuring it out as I went along, because there wasn't a clear model for women, and I don't think there needs to be. I don't believe in that.
Well, and I would put that question to you. What do you think?
No, absolutely. I don't think there is any one male or female. I think what it comes down to, your point about diversity. Each one of us is different, but it's not just because we're male or female. There's so many other reasons that make us different from one another. For however many people are in this room, that's how many different types of leadership style we have in the room. Everybody is unique. Every man I've worked with has had their own unique style, their own background, their own way of communicating, and it's really an individual style.
Yeah, and I wonder how you see it as you're shaping your leadership style.
I would echo what the other panelists have said already. I think that's kind of a false dichotomy. I think everybody needs to strive to be true to themselves, lead authentically, and that's what people respond to. Is
The authenticity
people
piece.
who are genuine. Yeah. And certainly my experiences as a woman have shaped what that means for me. But I don't think there's one model, and at least in the submarine community, I never felt the need to conform to sort of some like male stereotype leadership model. Unlike the Marine Corps infantry, for example, which you might think of as a very masculine group. Submariners are nerds, and nerds come in both genders, so that was never an issue for me because I already was
I
one.
didn't say that.
So I did. You can quote me on that. But I think for me, I just had to learn to be mature and confident in who I was and what I brought to the table.
Yeah. Right.
So I spent the last 3 years, right before I got out of the Marine Corps last year, down at the basic school in Quantico. So spent 3 years teaching brand new second lieutenants leadership, kind of how they're going to be platoon commanders. And I will say that the Marine Corps does have expectations, certain expectations on how you will behave, not necessarily, well, that's a whole other conversation, so I won't go too deep into it, but there are certain expectations on how you will behave as a leader. And most of it comes down to confidence, right? Confidence and competence, which I think everybody on the panel has spoken to. But I don't think that, like, we shape people in this direction. And I remember in a squadron, I was an attack helicopter pilot. I was often one of one woman, and as far as the pilots go, and there were certain expectations, and maybe there were some biases of, well, we need to get her to have that deeper voice. And I was like, guys, I got this, right? And so a lot of it comes back to your competence, but I don't necessarily think that is a woman or a man thing. There is an expectation in the Marine Corps. But I will say that your subordinates, until they get to know you, and maybe you guys can speak differently to this, but as a female officer coming into a shop of approximately 65 Marines, there was an initial difference on maybe how they treated me, what they talked to me about versus what my AOIC, what they talked to him about. And he had been a grunt when he was enlisted. Now he's this big, tough officer. He was a Huey pilot, not quite as cool as Cobras, but we still like him. But one quick anecdote for this, and maybe this can kind of illustrate what I'm trying to say, is we had one of my corporals, one of my best, really phenomenal Marine, really great. I was the Airframes OIC, officer in charge. And all of a sudden, his work just shot, right? Went straight down. And we couldn't figure it out. The gunny was getting frustrated, and my gunny was getting frustrated. And this corporal came and spoke to me. And what had happened was he and his wife were really concerned that she was having fertility issues, right? And so a good friend of mine happened to be a doc over at the hospital. We got his wife in the next day. Everything was figured out. He went back to being amazing. And I had to sit down with my gunny, who was definitely, we were a tag team, and he was so furious that this Marine didn't come to him. This Marine it was such an intimate detail about his wife that he was uncomfortable going to the gunny, but as a woman, he came to me. Now, would we have figured that out another way? Probably. And I'm not saying necessarily that that's right or wrong, but that is a reality that sometimes your Marines, your peers, sometimes your superiors as a woman do take you differently in what they confide in you, what they speak to you about. And most of that ends up not necessarily going away, but evening out the longer that you're in charge. But I did have that experience, and it worked out to our benefit in that case, I think.
Well, and it's interesting because I'm scheduled to give a talk at a different military institution in New York. I know. And my husband, when first I went to Navy, first time I went to West Point, said, "You have to finish your talk by yelling, 'Go Navy, beat Army.'" And I said, "But I'd like to come home to our children that weekend." But part of what I think is so important is that it really is about seeing the invisible, and that you don't have to be female to do that, but you have to be aware of different constituencies. And I think to the diversity point, the whole 360 view of what is happening, particularly in the wars that we are fighting today and the places where we are fighting them. It is really important to understand 360 degrees of the environment in which you're operating. And I think you continue to see the power of being able to see both perspectives, male and female, and all kinds of others that are included in that. I want to go to a policy question, which is, if you I'm going to give you each a magic policy wand and say, integration is done. We're not going to have a debate about whethers and could'ves, should'ves. We're going to have a discussion about the how. And if there were one thing that were going to make a difference from a leadership perspective, what would you say that it was on the policy front that would actually make a difference in moving the conversation forward to actual implementation?
From a policy standpoint, meritocracy is the key, a single standard. If you meet the standard, great, you can do the job. If you can't, go back and work at it, and if you eventually can, wonderful, but it's got to be a single standard, and if you meet it, you're done. From a leadership implementation point, you can't just talk the talk, you have to walk the walk. So you can't just say we want to integrate women, you actually have to do it. So leaders need to stand up, put out the policy, and then back it up with action. So those who meet it, put them in those jobs. Let them do it.
Do you think there is a gap between the word and the deed at the moment?
Speaking for the Coast Guard, which is where my experience is, no. Of course, we've been doing it since 1978, so I think we're an example that it can be done. I don't have the experience to say the Marine Corps has.
Anu, what would you say would be the policy lever that would make a difference or could make a difference in terms of the how?
I mean, from what I've seen, single physical fitness standards, which is still, I think, a very controversial topic within the military community, is something, it's considered very radical. And so I believe, the commander's referring not necessarily to single physical fitness standards as well, or to sort of MOS job specialties?
No, I would agree. I mean,
Yeah.
I'll give you an example of my personal life. I've been a firefighter with Fairfax County for 16 years. When I went through firefighter training, there was one standard. There was no male, female, didn't matter. So I had to carry the same load, throw the same ladders, do the same job as the men. And if I did it, great, I got my firefighter credentials.
Right.
So whatever the job is, the Marine Corps requires, the Navy requires, the Coast Guard requires.
I mean, you know, there's so much more segregation in the Marine Corps than there is in the other branches, and so, you know, I asked General Reynolds today about that issue, and I do believe that the Marine Corps needs to further integrate its basic training, you know, at the enlisted and officer levels. I think it sets up a separate and unequal system for men and women in the Marines. Yeah. You know, we've seen the Army, again, kind of move forward by leaps and bounds on this. And like functionally speaking, the Marine Corps isn't that different from the Army. So they sort of run out of excuses. Leadership has run out of excuses for that. Now, do I believe that, you know, tomorrow Paris Island should be fully integrated? No. I think it would, you know, there's a word I would like to use I'm not going to use today, but it's, there's a way to properly recruit young women who are phenomenal athletes for the Corps and all the branches. I don't think the Marine Corps fully commit to that idea that it's going to recruit its best and brightest and fittest women across America. You know, I've thought a lot about sort of even the academy route into, you know, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Coast Guard, and the contributions that may have happened. You know, the 3 women who went to Ranger School and were past Ranger School, having come from West Point, you know, is there a leg up that the academies can give at least our junior officers so that they can excel more at some of these incredibly rigorous combat arms schools? And the answer may be yes. You know, the Marine Corps doesn't have that direct pipeline, but you know, at the recruiting and initial training phase, I think we're failing women.
We're failing women, and I wonder, Major, what you think. Do you think that we're failing women? And what's the policy lever that you think matters the most? You've been straddling worlds in terms of both looking at the policy piece and obviously serving.
Yeah, mine might be more specific to the Marine Corps, but I mean, there is a certain, right now we're operating kind of the, if you build it, she will come, right? Which is great.
And I did read a piece the other day about Marine Corps going to high school is looking for physical
And I think we need to be better at that, to be perfectly honest. I think we need to be better at who we're recruiting, but not just that. We need to be better at preparing, especially young women, for the physical rigors of infantry officer school. And here's the beauty of it, right? If we come, there's so many phenomenal programs out there. I'm a subscriber to CrossFit, but I'm not necessarily saying that that's the answer. Whatever the answer is, mountain athletes, great. All of these things, there are ways out there to prepare for these various screeners. So we need to just be pushing this out to the public and then, you know, valuing people's initiative. And the beauty of that is it's not just going to be women that are going to benefit from it, men are going to benefit from it as well. Right? So not just, hey, can you run 3 miles in this amount of time, do this many pull-ups. That's not a realistic expectation for any Marine to make it through IOC or on the enlisted side, right? So if we do not just set these standards, but also with these standards, how do you get there? Here's a 12-week program. Hey, are you really struggling physically? Expect this is gonna take a year, but this is how to get there. And we put that out free for the masses. I really think, again, that's kind of more of a tactical level suggestion, but I think that that is gonna help extremely well, and it's gonna encourage people on top of going out and recruiting these, not just these athletes, I want the brains there too. I know we have a knuckle dragger mentality in the Marine Corps, but we want brains as well as brawn, so getting that combination is really ideal.
And Lieutenant, if you would say the one thing that you would say would make a difference in terms of the integration, what do you think will happen the first time we see a female Navy SEAL? I mean, is there a symbolism factor that also matters? Because I will say, as somebody who covered Ranger School, no one saw that story being as big as it turned out to be. I mean, people were genuinely, reporters, writers, people close to it, people far away, were shocked by that becoming a mainstream, one of the biggest stories of the year. And what was fascinating in that is that you go down to cover either Benning at 4:15 a.m. at the gate of Benning, or the lovely South Florida, the swamp that you get to enjoy in August. And what you would see is that the only word that anybody wanted to use was standard. Both the women who were the ranger instructors, who were the RAs, and then the people who were part of the program, was that there's only one standard. And standard is the word that ends up being in everybody's story 750 times, because it was the only quote anybody would give you, that there is one standard, and that's what we're going to meet. And you talk to rangers who've done 12 or 13 or 14, post 9/11 deployments, and some of the newer guys, and that would be the word that everybody tackled you with.
I think you've hit on an important point. I think as more women integrate into these communities and prove that they can do it, you'll see a lot more people be accepting of it. And I think there's an interesting phenomenon that the closer you get to the women in these communities, the higher their approval rating is from the men around them, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that's because it might start with someone who might have had a gender bias, had never worked with women, and all of a sudden you're an exception in their mind. Oh, not you, ma'am.
Right.
I didn't mean that about you. And that's an okay place to start in some ways. I remember that a lot as a midshipman with my male friends
The
at a
people would say
male-dominated
things
school.
about-
Oh, Kayla, we didn't mean you. I'm like, well, we need to start thinking about why do you feel that way about me? It's because you know me, because you've worked with me, because you've observed me perform well. And I think on the ships that are integrated, you ask even the most junior sailor, what do you think about serving with women? They're like, it's not a big deal and kind of great. But if you ask someone who hasn't served with women yet, they might not be sure, but that's because they haven't experienced it yet. So I think it's important to just continue to work towards mentorship programs, getting women there so that we can reach a critical mass where it's not really an issue anymore.
Yeah, and I would encourage folks, this is my last question, and we'll go to all of you, so be ready, and there are microphones right around you, and that we'll be delighted to hear from you. That was actually my experience, too, in the special operations community. And I remember recently, it's actually online, there was an interview with one of the SEALs of SEAL Team 6 who was being interviewed, and we said, well, what do you think about, isn't it so shocking that women are going to be able to be SEALs? Isn't that awful? Isn't that crazy? And he said, well, I was out with them in 2011. I was out with them years ago. It's not a big deal if they can meet the standard. And the anchor was like ashen because, it had never really, that was obviously not in his prep note. But, here was a SEAL who was like, I was out with them. And in fact, some of the young women who were nationals were out with them, 5 years ago. So no, I don't think it's a big deal as long as they can meet the standard. I want to end my round of questions looking at history because this is obviously an incredibly storied institution. And the thing that strikes me all the time in writing or talking about this is that 50 years from now, this whole conversation will look so different. And I remember one ranger telling me about Ashley and her teammates, so many of the other women are in the story, but after the first time he met them, that he had said to another ranger, in language, well, I won't start with the first part of a sentence, you can imagine it, but he said, these women may one day be our own Tuskegee Airmen. That they're going to make history, nobody knows they exist, and they're just doing it because their country asked. And so I wonder, as you think about the historical perspective, how do you see both the advice you would give to some of the folks who are just entering the ranks now, and also how do you see history will have its way with this conversation that we're having now? I'll start with you.
I'm not worried about history. All of this is going to change for the better. Progress is happening. It's happened. I hope I have a bunch of daughters someday so they can all join the military. That's
and
the
you would
easy,
encourage
that's
them
the
to.
easy question. I would urge them to join Army, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard right now. Yeah, I would. And it's honest. It's an honest, it's an honest assessment. I want them to be valued, and I think it's going to take the Marine Corps a little more time. So, and your other question was,
what advice would you give to
what
those
advice? I was thinking about some of the input that our senior leaders were given all of us earlier today. And I just really want to focus on vulnerability, which I think General Dunwoody touched on this a little bit. But we talk a lot about like the heroic figures in our lives, which can be very inspiring. But one thing that probably would have helped me a lot more when I was going through the Marines as a junior officer, not really knowing how hard it would be. It was very hard for me. I came from a very different culture. And I didn't have mentors early on. I found them a few years in, and that was hard. That was almost unique for me. It's like really grounding myself in who I was, where I came from, like who my friends are, what I believe in. We're all so young when we join, but during like the most difficult moments, I don't think I had that. I didn't have that to lean on. I wasn't able to talk to my parents, like the general was talking about that earlier today. I didn't have friends back home who related at all to my military experience. So I was very alone. I was very, very isolated. And that's a risky place to be when you're going through really hostile circumstances. So, hold on to your friends. If you have a faith tradition, if you have close relatives, really keep them close, because they will matter. They will matter during those harder times.
Thanks, and I'm going to go to you, Andrea.
First off, when this whole discussion came about, I said, you know what, I really want to, in, I don't know, however many years, have one of my corporals come up and be like, whoa, ma'am, you were in the Corps before women could do whatever they wanted, right? And that's kind of, sorry ladies, that's kind of when I look at like the 80s, like the 80 graduates in here, so huge round of applause for all of you. But, I mean, I graduated in 2005, so I'm like, whoa, wait, you were around, you were looking at colleges before this was allowed to be done? I mean, I'm really looking forward to that. And my advice would be to the women in the room, do it. Like, there's gonna be really hard times ahead of you, and it's nice when you find another woman, because sometimes you really need that. Anybody who wants, come up after, I'll give you my email address, and it's nice to, there are certainly individuals here in the crowd, your own Colonel McGrath here is one of them, but who at times when I was facing headwinds, it was great to have a touchstone and be like, am I crazy? It's like, nope, just keep going, keep moving, keep one foot in front of the other. And some days it is gonna be 1 foot in front of the other, but you know what? I knew I wanted to go to combat offensively. I knew I wanted a gun, and I knew the only way at the point in 2005 when I graduated I was getting that was to fly and attack helicopters, so I did it. And there are women that are much braver and much more hardcore than me, but if you really want it, get out there and do it. And for the men in the audience, look around, like these are your peers, these are your classmates. The more you build up that cohesive team of women and men, and the more you crush other individuals who will speak poorly about a woman in your command, or pick your minority, it's not just women, then the stronger you're making your command and the stronger of a leader that you are. So that would be my advice.
Sort of tied with what the other ladies have said, I would say my big piece of advice would be you really have to know yourself. And what's interesting is for me, my aha moment didn't come till I was a lieutenant commander. I was applying for the White House Fellows Program. And that's
Which you got?
I did. 6 months worth of interviews and essays, and before the interviews I had mock interviews and prep work, and I would get asked a question, the 30-second elevator speech, tell me about yourself. And my first answer was really just like a list of resume bullets. Well, I'm a Coast Guard officer, I'm a cutterman, I'm a volunteer firefighter, I've got a degree in this, degree in that, and I belong to these organizations. It's really just a resume list. And they kept pushing me to go, well, why are you all those things? You do all these weird things and they don't really seem connected. Why? So that really caused me to think, and I figured it out. It's actually, what are the core characteristics that make me who I am? And what it kind of changed over time to was, I love solving real world problems. I would not do well in academia because I don't want to write a paper and have it sit on a shelf and not influence anything. I want to influence a real world problem today, and the harder the better. I love training, teaching, and mentoring. And once I knew that about myself, then I knew, yes, these events may seem totally different, but because they have those same core characteristics, these are great for me. I also knew what to say no to when I would get offered opportunities. No, that's not quite my thing, thank you very much. So once I had a really good understanding of what makes me tick, what I like, what I don't like, what I'm good at, that really helped me figure out which direction to head in. The military is not for everyone. I unfortunately had an operations officer one time who was struggling, And part of me trying to figure out what was going on, I finally asked her, I said, what do you want to be doing in 5-10 years? She said she wanted to be teaching small children. Operations officer on a major Coast Guard cutter was not the career path that was going to get her there. So she got off track. She needed to find the right path to get her to where she wanted to go in life. So you really have to know yourself and really ask yourself those hard questions.
And craft your own narrative. Which
Exactly,
really
exactly.
And now we will end our section with you.
I'll keep it quick because I can avoid redundancy by being last, but I would just say follow what you're passionate about. I became passionate about serving on submarines when senior officers still patted you on the head and thought it was adorable if you wanted to do that when you were a woman. So over the few years at the Academy,
And that couldn't have been very long ago. I mean, you've only been out.
2010 was when the first class commissioned, so I wanted to do it as a midshipman. It wasn't open to me, and I was lucky that they changed that my senior year, and I was able to volunteer to swap from a nuke SWO over to the submarine side. But being a junior officer in the military is really hard for a lot of different reasons. And if you're not doing something you care about, you're going to lose steam really fast. And it's passion and relationships that keep you going. So make sure that you're seeking out the opportunities that you truly care about. Not to be the first necessarily, not because it's cool, not because you fly the fastest necessarily, unless that's what you're passionate about, but follow your heart and you'll do okay.
Excellent. And with that, I would love to turn some of the questions over to the audience if there are any. I think we have one up here.
Good evening. I'm Second Lieutenant Dupree. I'm at TBS right now. I have a question for whoever wants to take it. Do you think that meeting a standard or a system based solely on merit would actually create the diverse climate that we really want and that we say is better in a command? And another way to put that is, would it take too long to reach that critical mass that we want to?
Okay. Is there a tension between diversity and merit, and will it take too long?
I think when we speak meritocracy, and you're a second lieutenant at TBS, so I'm sure the first thing that comes to mind is how fast do you do the O course, right? But meritocracy, maybe it's in defining what the meritocracy is based on, is that we can really get to the core of the diversity. Like I said before, having diversity for the sake of diversity kind of defeats the point, but recognizing what diversity brings to the table and then creating a system that encourages those things. At TBS, you know, I watched this exercise once where essentially, think of it like we go to different stations, and to succeed at those stations, maybe one of them was physical fitness, but another was a card full of a bunch of different languages, and you had to translate as many as possible, and your team got penalized or they got to go forward, depending on who in your team spoke, who in your squad spoke that language, or who didn't speak that language, or who can translate the most. So I think maybe defining what that meritocracy is based on is really where we are going to get diversity, and maybe that's where a lot of the work needs to be done. I think you have an excellent point. Sure, if we're just saying who can go the fastest and the furthest, maybe we're not going to get the most diverse group in the next 2 or 3 years, but redefining that might be a valuable point.
You want to weigh in on that? Okay. Okay, great. Over here, please. We'll just go back and forth.
Yes, thank you. My name is Inga Brown. I'm an Army veteran, and I have first a comment and then a question for the Coast Guard. My comment is actually more of a plug. There is a combat integration handbook that will be presented to DACOWITS, the Defense Advisory Committee on Women in the Service, on Tuesday. It's a handbook that was written by a group of Army veterans at Women in International Security. It is targeted for an Army audience of battalion, company, platoon level leaders, but there may be useful information for all services that are now getting ready to integrate women into combat arms organizations. Now, with that, my question is, if the Coast Guard has had no exceptions since 1978, over 30 years when the 4 cutters went to Iraq, how is it possible you are still the single female personnel, the single female officer among 4 cutters after over 30 years of no exceptions? And it's a concern I have as we open combat roles to women, that there won't be enough women that go for it.
There were actually many women cuttermen before me, Captain Beverly Kelly was a trailblazer in our service who commanded our largest class of cutters many years before me, which is why it was so easy for me to command. The issue with Iraq, it came down to basically these are small patrol boats, and it was a matter of the logistics of lodging on board. So for example, the berthing area, it was one giant berthing area in the stern and one in the bow. So you either had to have all women in there or all men. So it was more of logistics. It was very easy to put the CO and the XO as male or female on those classes of cutter. It was hard to do it. You had to do it in a group setting. Now, our newer classes of ships that we're building have little small individual berthing areas, so we can have that integration. That was not by, the billets weren't restricted. It was more a matter of the logistics of you didn't want males and females sharing the same racks in the same berthing area.
Over here, please.
First class, Katie Ryle. So my question is, you briefly touched on seeing the same standard physically for males and females. The PRT at the Naval Academy is one of those areas of tension between the genders. Do you believe that the Naval Academy should create a single standard for both males and females? And if so, would you use the male standard for that or reassess and find some sort of compromise?
I'll take that one.
So I kind of have two answers for you. For my community, you see a real interesting range of physical fitness levels. You need to pass the PRT to stay in the military because that's military policy, but I wouldn't say your physical stature has a lot of relevance to my career field. And so for me, it's about, do you look professional in uniform? Are you healthy? Can we take you underway and trust that you're going to be able to do your job? I don't have a real problem personally with different PRT standards in the Navy for men and women. I think at the Naval Academy it's a little bit hard because as midshipmen know the nuts and bolts of how you get ranked here, and your PRT score has a big bearing on your overall order of merit and your standing in the class. And so I think that's a little bit of a harder question because you don't see a lot of the PRT standards here are higher than in the fleet, and people are trying to get 100%. They're not trying to, pass so that they don't get in trouble and put on the, program for remediation, right? Like you see people striving for excellence here, and I think having a woman, run an 830 to get 100% alongside her male classmate who that could really affect your, say, graduation order, your standing in the company, your ability to compete for leadership positions. I don't know if that necessarily makes sense in my opinion. You guys might have different views on that.
We have something similar. I know when I was a cadet at the Coast Guard Academy, we had the same different standards for men and women. Part of that is what are you measuring? So for example, on your PRT, are you measuring just physical fitness, how healthy a person is, how fit they are? Because what's fit for, say, a 20-year-old male versus a 43-year-old female are not going to be the same. We might be equally healthy, but we're not going to run the same distance in the same amount of time. That's different than, say, for example, for me in the Coast Guard, if I'm going to send a boarding team over to board a vessel, it doesn't matter how old you are, how tall you are, male, female, everyone on that team has to scale the side of that ship. It's the same exact job. So when you're talking about a job standard to do a job, that does need to be the same. If you're measuring fitness, though, that's actually a different thing that you're measuring, and I can see why a difference would exist for fitness.
Can I say something? So, I think all of these measures for promotion and evaluation can be weighted differently, but I also want to put out there, women can do so much more than we give them credit for physically. I saw this in the Marine Corps where there were so many women in the Marines who literally had never seen the inside of a weight room, right? Like that was a shock. You can't do pull-ups. You can't like generate that amount of muscle mass unless you weight train, unless you've been doing it for a while, right? So, this notion that like women can't do pull-ups, it was so absurd to me and so many other women who've been in athletics for a while. So you have to train in order to do that task, just like any other military task. You are not going to be able to do 20 pull-ups in a month of training. That's not how it works, right? And so again, I go back to the recruiting phase. Women will be able to do pull-ups and many other things if they train for those tasks with a lot of time ahead of day one at Paris Island or OCS. I've noticed, I worked out with some phenomenal athletes in the civilian world. It's just that the opportunities for them were not in the military at the time. They were more interested in playing Division I sports, right? Because they were treated equally. So I feel like when we equalize standards, okay, fine, maybe like promotion shouldn't just rest on your PFT score, fine. But yes, I do think it creates resentment among men when there are women who aren't working as hard in that particular area. I think women can do so much more. I've seen it. I kind of want us to believe a little more in our physical capabilities. We can do this.
And it's interesting because one of the things you saw a lot in the reporting, I was spending a couple years in that world on the special operations side, was that the gym was the equalizer. The advice that every trainer gave to the women who were about to go on the front lines was stay in the gym, get in the gym, stay in the gym. And it's not only physically, but it's also culturally part of this world. So I think it's fascinating discussion. Over here, please.
Good evening, ladies. Thank you so much. My name is Lieutenant Commander Kelly Welsh. I'm class of 2000. Thank you. Just going to give a shout out to my sister Megan, who's class of 05, Katie's classmate there. I'm really excited about this panel tonight. I think you ladies crushed it because I think this conversation is extremely relevant and it's extremely important. I think we're all privileged to be in a room full of supporters tonight. I can tell you that there are still several skeptics out there, and while policies have been implemented to lift these exclusions, there are a lot of boundaries still in place, and the conversation about standards in my mind is sort of just everybody gets it. So I would love to know what piece of information would you arm people with that doesn't necessarily relate to standards to convince the skeptics that women can do this?
I'm going to go to you, Angie, because you were doing no exceptions. You were country when country wasn't cool.
Yeah, it was very not cool. Standards is the easiest one for the skeptics. Like, hey, put it out there. Who's the best? For no exceptions, ours was no quotas, one standard, no exceptions. That was what we told everybody. It really does speak to the skeptics. I'll tell you what, at TBS, I have a lot of friends who are currently right now infantry officer course instructors. And so there's a lot of good, solid debate. But it really did come around a lot of what was said earlier of them having, kick-ass young women who were their second lieutenants that they were training. And, I have one buddy who's like a bear of a man. He walks around with a 90-pound pack on his back like he's going to first grade. But, he had this young woman he was a fellow SPC of mine, and he had this young woman, and she was just tough as nails. And he's like, yeah, I think she could do it. And we used to call her his mini-me, but a lot of it does come down to exposure. But with the skeptics, truly, what I have found, and I've done a lot of arguing publicly and privately, is it does come down to the standards. It comes down to the standards and then fostering the environment. Like, hey, this is up to you, right? You can, this conversation earlier, you can poison your platoon, you can poison your unit by saying, oh, we don't want those women folk in, because those women folk are coming, right? They're coming. And so what are you going to do? Are you going to poison it? Are you going to have a lot of internal strife? Or are you going to be a really great leader and say, okay, we're going to be the best. I don't want to hear anything about this, but let's train and create that cohesion.
Hi. Erica Wagaman, class of 83. And I just want to state that I pissed off my firsties a lot plebe year because I kept stating that I wanted to go nuke subs. And when they would ask what I was going to service select if I made it through their institution, I, of course, said nuke subs. for about 6 months, and then I really got to know a Marine officer, mostly through trying to pass him chow at the table, and he said no, in the Marine Corps, junior personnel eat first. And it hit me like a bolt right then. I needed to be one of those, because that's the way I believed. So anyway, that's just my little anecdote there. I did end up going Marine Corps, since I couldn't go on nuke subs. And I work now down in Quantico, and I sit at the table just about weekly with Recruiting Command, and I work at Training Command on all of the entry-level training. So I just wanted to reassure Miss, I believe it's Bhagwati, I think that's how you pronounce your name, that actually the recruiters do work with the women in the delayed entry program you might have heard of for about a year, specifically working on pull-ups before they go to MCRD. The OSOs are working with all of the officers on being able to do pull-ups as well as the other physical standards they'll need. The women that display interest in the areas in which, for example, some of the artillery, to be able to lift the artillery rounds and that sort of thing, they have Marine-specific physical standards, MISPAs now, that males and females must pass. They are working with the women to be able to pass those. And the recruiters are very interested in success. So I just wanted to let you all know I'm in on the ground level of what's going on day to day, week to week. And it is more positive, perhaps, than the media likes to portray, okay? And I was in on the ground level of the women that General Reynolds spoke about earlier today, and the training that they went through, the process and all of that. The Marine Corps does not want to break a generation of America's finest women. So the Marine Corps wants to do it right and make sure that we're taking the proper steps, because we are a lot harder physically, and I'm happy to talk to whomever afterward, in a lot of areas. And so I believe, truly believe, I'm not standing here as an apologist for the Marine Corps or whatever. I'm here because I want the Marine Corps to get it right, and that's why, as a retiree, I'm now working there as a civilian to watch what's going on and to be a part of what's going on.
Thank you.
So anyway, so I just want to let you know, it's getting better, okay? And I know it sounds like you had a terrible experience or 2 or 3, and I'm sorry about that, but it is getting better, truly is. My question would be, now that we've got this in front of us, and you do, I heard that term critical mass, and I'm very interested. As class of '83, we graduated 53 women from the Naval Academy. 55 women went in the Marine Corps from this last class, which is really thrilling to me that they have the numbers to be able to do that. How do you build this critical mass? Do you put all of your females in one unit to try to get to a critical mass in that unit, say an infantry battalion, as we get these infantry officers, or do we sprinkle them all about? I'm interested in what y'all think.
Thank you. Okay, and we're going to have, we'll take a stab at that answer, and then I'm going to try in the remaining 6 minutes to get to as many folks as we can.
Yeah, I'm actually very against the concept of critical mass. I think that the way,
the idea that
the idea that you can only put women into unit if there's more than one woman. There's all sorts of statistics that figure out what exactly critical mass is. Yes, it's certainly a nice to have, but when you do that, the expectation is, okay, these men can't lead these young women coming in, so we need women to lead women, and that's just the wrong message to send. Now, I will caveat that very quickly with the Norwegians, I think did this really well. Commanders were given essentially women who are either retirees or out of the service now as a touchstone. Essentially to go to this individual and be like, hey, okay, what am I missing? Because we have to foster that conversation. It has to be fostered, right? In the Marine Corps, we have a really unique opportunity with the way our first sergeant track goes, our first sergeant major track. You do not have to go up in the MOS into a unit in which you go into. So it's a really great opportunity to put these female leaders who've come up through the Corps into these combat MOS units, and they're there, and they're a touchstone for that company commander or that battalion commander, and I think that it's a really easy way to solve that problem, but I think critical mass is very dangerous because what we do is we delay integration by forcing women to go in en masse, and we're sending the wrong message to leadership.
There's also I would add to that kind of a double-edged sword to some of these policies. We see it here at the Naval Academy. There is a cap on the number of women that can go into submarines every year, and that's because they want to so closely manage what does critical mass in the wardroom mean, how many racks are in each room. You know, the devil gets lost in the details pretty quickly, and there's this talented pool of women who want to go, and they compete for these spots tooth and nail. And if you talk to, say, our human resources people, they'd say, oh, you can only have 3 women on each submarine. Well, I deployed with 5 women on my submarine for 2 of my 3 deployments because that's just the rotation. And nobody blinked an eye and said, hey, how are we going to handle having 5 women instead of 3? So I think it wasn't hard for us to figure that out. You just add up the right number of racks and it was okay. Right. So I think you can trap yourself into limiting how much talent you can bring into a community by trying to socially engineer it a little bit too much.
Okay, I'm going to go here, and then we're going to try to make this. I would ask everybody to keep their questions beneath the 60-second mark.
Okay. Good evening, ladies. Lieutenant Junior Grade Elizabeth Powers, class of 2014. I was wondering if you could answer the same question we talked about with policy and integration, and apply that question to what policy or what program would you like to add in order to increase retention for female officers?
I'll take that one. I'm not sure it's a policy issue. I would say mentoring. A lot of times when I've seen it's not just for women. When I've seen people come out of the service, it could be whether it's women, whether it's minorities, or just men, doesn't matter. They need strong mentors, not just a mentor, mentors from a variety of areas, because if these people can help them figure out what they're good at, what's a good career path for you. I had a mentor one time say, you know, you'd be great in the Office of Budget and Program Review, and I rolled my eyes because I thought, ugh, that's horrible. But he knew me and said, no, I think you should take a look at this. It's really more public policy based, and you'd be great at it. He was absolutely right. I went down that road, had a blast at it. If he had not steered me in that direction, my career might have foundered, and I might not have stayed in. So having people help you is critical, and I think that applies no matter who you are.
Paternity leave. I think that military officers need more than 10 days. Military men need more than 10 days. I think that it sends a message, one, that onus of childcare, especially post childbirth, is both equally a man and a woman's. And 2, for the dual military couples, and I say this having been a dual military couple, both of us are active duty. You know, I watched a lot of friends go through, and like women, now we have 3 months, which is great, but men are given 10 days to give their wives like the ability to get back on their feet, back like mentally, physically, everything. And I really think that but oddly enough, I think one of the answers to that is paternity leave. Like it needs to be more than 10 days. It's absolutely absurd. Maybe it's a share. I don't know what the answer is. Got a lot of ideas. We don't have the time, but I think that's one of the solutions.
Hi, good evening. My name is Lieutenant Colonel Allison Thompson, and I kind of felt compelled to just make a quick comment. I was class of 94. Yep. And much like with the submarines, most of the time I was in the Naval Academy, I couldn't go Marine Aviation because of combat exclusion.
Could you speak just a little bit more loud?
Hey,
Yeah.
All right. I was saying as class of 94 and much as the same experiences with the submariners, most of the time I was at the Naval Academy, I could not go Marine Aviation until Congress lifted combat exclusion for combat aircraft about 3-4 weeks before we had to service select. So for the first time ever, women were allowed to select Marine Aviation. So many of these experiences that have gone on for generations before, as far as being first, that I was experiencing, being a first, going into squadrons, combat arms, and you know, folks that have recently graduated and those who haven't yet to graduate, and our young enlisted up here from Lejeune, shout out to you guys, will experience as well. We keep having these same conversations, and in reference to the critical mass, I've thought a lot about this. Colonel McGrath and I have had some conversations as well because we were in ready rooms where we were the one of, and I've also been at the basic school where there was a concerted effort to put 2 females per platoon. And I think it goes down to that esprit de corps, that feeling of teamwork, of being part of the team that was discussed earlier in the panel this afternoon. I think you can get that from your peers. I think you get that from leadership. There was discussion on leadership. I take some exception. Obviously, I'm standing here today as the first female squadron CEO in the Marine Corps. There was opportunities. It's not without challenge, but there are opportunities, and I feel I have to say that on behalf of the Marines and hopefully potential Marines, because Marine Corps needs you, so don't get discouraged. When I was at the Naval Academy, there was a major who was the OIC for the Airborne Training Unit, and when Marine Corps Aviation opened, I was afraid. I wanted to do it, but it seemed really scary, and he said, if you can hump your pack, you can do it. And you can be accepted in the Marine Corps. And at that time, and relative to being a pilot, it is metaphoric, and now the discussion has turned to literal. So can we hump our pack? Can you accomplish the mission? And this goes to the competency piece. But then institutionally, what is the priorities? There's discussion today, life-work balance, and what are the priorities? Institutionally, what are the priorities? Do we need to redefine how much that pack weighs? We're looking at how many are in a squad, how many squads in a company. So fundamentally, what do we need to do to protect our nation, to go forward and fight tomorrow's fights? Maybe that means doing 20 pull-ups. Maybe that means some subset doing 20 pull-ups or some other metric. And then other folks being fit, but also mentally exceedingly strong, because it takes everything to fight the wars that our nation is fighting today. So I just wanted to make that comment relative to the Marine Corps.
Thank you very much. And I think with that, I will say that it is not easy to get up here and be in the hot seat and say things that sometimes make all of us uncomfortable, or put forward ideas that may in 10 years be conventional wisdom, but today feel a little bit forward-leaning. So I want to thank all of our panelists for really making the time to give us such great fodder for thought and for conversation. And this is a topic, somebody was asking me about writing about this as a civilian, and I said, well, what's fascinating is I've never written about anything anywhere in the world where people have more confidence in their opinions and less tethering to a set of facts. So I will say that as an outsider, and I believe that deeply. So I just want to say, I know this is a conversation that arouses passions for reasons that still do slightly elude me. And I would say that I hope you all continue to have the conversation, and have the conversation with the unconverted and the converted, and really from a position of knowledge and facts and leadership. So thank you so much.
We'd like to just say one more time, thank you to our panelists. The most precious thing that you really have is your time. And we'd like to thank Gayle Lemmon for coming all the way down here to do this moderation. It was superb. Anuradha Bhagwati, Holly Harrison, Kayla Barron, and Katie Van Dam, thank you for giving us your wisdom, your experience, and your thoughts tonight. It was truly an excellent panel. I've been to a lot of these. This was a good one. And for your efforts, you each get a Naval Institute press book on women in the Navy. But thank you for your work. And I just want to remind all our guests that we start again at 08:45 tomorrow morning with our kickoff speaker in the morning is Michelle Flournoy. So thank you and good evening.